I had my first Nazi dream when I was about 14. In my dream, a group of Nazis are chasing me down Market Street in Boardman, Ohio. I woke up, my heart pounding, in a sweat. I don't know if my dad was up already or if I woke him up, but I remember him just holding me and rocking me back and forth. Philip Roth wrote about an Anne Frank game that he says all Jewish people play, where they determine who among their Gentile friends would hide them if the Nazis were coming. I play my own version, where I wonder if the Holocaust were coming again and the Nazis were on the rise, would I see the racist writing on the wall and get out in time? Would I believe my government capable of such treachery, or would I just be disappointed that I couldn't join the Hitler Youth Scouts? These are questions that Jews ask themselves, or I am a Jew. This is a question I ask myself. I was really into the Holocaust when I was in junior high. That came out weird. Maybe it was having a survivor for my first Hebrew school teacher. She taught us how to make the ch sound by imagine you are choking on a shank bone. Maybe it was being one of the only Jewish kids in my public school, and I could feel special every time they taught the Holocaust in class, and my teacher could turn to me for my expert opinion. One of the teachers, every year when they would read Number the Stars, remember that book? He would have me bring in my Star of David that I got from my bat mitzvah. And I don't know, the Holocaust was my thing. 8th grade was the height of my obsession. One afternoon in English class, my assistant principal was doing pictures, showing pictures of the trip he took to Poland and Israel. And suddenly I was struck with this overwhelming emotion. It just washed over me. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to make a scene. I was a kid who cried a lot. So I contained my emotions and went to lunch. A couple periods later, my teacher is having us come up to her desk to go over papers. And she had some critique on one of my papers, and I don't know what happened. It just triggered. All the feelings came back, and I made a scene. The bell rang, and so she asked me what was wrong. And I confessed that a few periods earlier, I thought I had a past life experience about the Holocaust. It was a weird thing to say. But I was a weird kid. Her response was less than supportive. "No, you didn't," she said. "You were really upset because you didn't get the grade you wanted on your essay." In her view, I was not being triggered by some sort of past life collective cultural trauma. I was a spoiled brat who had made up some elaborate story about reincarnation to get out of criticism and make someone feel sorry for me. And after that, I felt weird talking about the Holocaust. This also corresponded with a personal isolation from my Jewish community. My favorite rabbi left. I quit post-bat mitzvah confirmation class after it became clear that no one was going to take any action against the rich asshole who tormented me by shooting paper balls down my shirt. My dad still dragged me to lead services with him at the Jewish nursing home in town, but that was about it. When it came time to apply for my own Holocaust remembrance trip when I was 18, I was stoked to have an experience that would refocus me, that would reignite my Judaism. I want to cry, I wrote in my personal statement. I'd read and heard about the overwhelming experience people had when they go on those kinds of trips. This experience would bring me home and make me feel like a good Jew again. First stop, Poland. We're walking through what used to be the Warsaw Ghetto, and these 16-year-olds are looking around at what are now apartment high-rises, and they scoff. I can't believe people live here. Not exactly where my mind went. I grew up in an area without a lot of Jews, and I was used to putting my people's suffering in the context of other minority groups. And here, I discovered Jews could be just as myopic as Christians in Ohio. At one point, we visited Auschwitz, and I thought this would be it. This would be the moment. But I still didn't cry. I sat in a gas chamber with a votive candle leaning against a wall covered in human scratch marks. And my eyes were completely dry. Next, Israel. I cried once on the trip at the Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. In the last room, you enter into a candlelit area full of pictures of children who perished in the Holocaust, with a recording of either children's voices or someone reading their names. And this did it. I left the room and I started crying. I was cured. Throughout the trip, sometimes they would have us sit around and talk about our feelings, process what was happening. I was a politically minded kid, and I was itching to discuss my misgivings about the separation wall that Israel was building in the West Bank and Gaza. Not that I really knew much about the occupation and the specific ways Palestinian rights were being infringed. I knew that the Berlin Wall had been bad. Being raised by liberal baby boomers, I knew military was bad. I knew that a wall meant not peace. I'd just come from a youth leadership conference in DC where we heard from the president of Seeds of Peace. It's a group that brings young Jews and Arabs together to find common ground before they got indoctrinated. And I was roaring to dialogue about all these political thoughts and feelings in my brain. All I did was bring up Seeds of Peace in our group, just brought it up. And one kid interrupted me and he said, "You know they're totally anti-Israel, right?" I was stunned. I mean, wasn't this organization working for peace? Wasn't the president of it Jewish? Weren't debate and dialogue Jewish values? And then more people piled on. I'd always been considered a good Jew, even if I was alienated from my peers in Hebrew school. It was usually because my thinking was beyond them, and they were idiots. My teachers recognized that and encouraged me. Here felt different. They were still idiots. Jesus Christ, there were so many of them. For the first time, I felt maybe I was getting Judaism wrong. That there was something wrong with me if I didn't feel comfortable wholeheartedly with all of Israel's military actions or the whole lack of separation of church and state thing. Weren't Jewish values supposed to be like dialogue between people of different backgrounds and fighting for human dignity? You know, 10 Jews, 12 opinions. I got home and told my dad about the experience. "You think too much," he said, encouraging me not to look at things in such a black and white way. Told him how so many of the kids on the group bought Israeli army shirts to take home and how I didn't get one for him because I knew he wouldn't want one. "Not necessarily," he said. What? So I spent about a decade in the wilderness trying to avoid engaging with the Jewish world. A kind of Jewish Rumspringa. Still following the headlines, receiving emails from my dad's family in Israel about how the media is secretly pro-Arab and selling out the Jews. In college, I would go to Friday Shabbat dinners with my uncle's family and watched in confusion as my cousins transformed from secular frat bros to conservative, ultra-Orthodox family men. It didn't help that the Bush administration was in power during most of this time, so it was hard enough having critical left-wing conversation on anything, let alone about Israel. But mostly, I wished I didn't give a fuck. I wished I could take my revulsion for the idea of a modern religious state and tell the rabbinate to suck it, as well as my exasperation with the politically incorrect, racist American Jewish nationalists who go over to join the Israeli army to play Rambo. But then, I think of my grandma Maddie, who joined a liberal Zionist youth group in Canada to rebel against her beauty queen mother, who only missed out on going to start a kibbutz because she met a young man who'd just come from running guns to Israel on a yacht. I could have been Israeli. And then there's my other grandma, Ruth, in photos visiting Israel with my grandpa and my dad for the first time in the early 80s, blissfully floating in the Dead Sea. For them, Israel was uncomplicated, or at least less complicated. For them, Israel wasn't this big religious movement. In fact, a lot of early Zionism was about rejecting religion, breaking free of archaic Jewish traditions they believed had been holding them back for 2,000 years. My grandmothers weren't thinking about religious settlements or Arabs. They were thinking about a sense of home, belonging, mystery, transcendence. I wish I could feel that. My first memory of Israel? When I was 9 years old, I remember in the middle of Hebrew school learning that Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was shot by an Israeli religious extremist. So it was never an inspiring or a hopeful place. It was just exhausting. Interestingly, exhaustion is a big part of how birthright operates. What do I mean? They keep you really underslept. You walk a lot. You are accosted with high levels of pathos and emotion. In service of what? You ask. What do the Israeli government and wealthy Jewish donors hope to achieve by sending groups of Jews ages 18 to 26 on an all-expenses 10-day tour of the Holy Land? On the one hand, there's support for Israel, both political and monetary, and making more Jewish babies because of the Holocaust. I wasn't even going to do birthright. Why invite more opportunities to feel shitty and pissed off? But then my dad's journalist friend recommended I check out J Street, which was this new, hip, left-wing Jewish lobbying group. They're having a series of meetups at apartments in New York. And there I met old, salty Jews who were also frustrated with Israel's military actions and its religious extremism, who echoed the values of my liberal grandparents, my people. And then I went to the J Street conference in 2012, where not only did I meet a bunch of like-minded American Jews, but also balls-to-the-walls liberal Israelis. This gave me the confidence to think maybe I could survive birthright. And maybe I could have a stake in the future of Judaism, and going on Birthright would at least allow me to criticize it intelligently. Unlike my first trip to Israel, I had no expectations of getting what I needed. I was here for research, for context. My Birthright trip became an exercise in endurance, a sort of hunger strike to avoid drinking the propaganda Kool-Aid. The high water mark for this is Masada, in which you get up at sunrise to hike up a desert fortress where hundreds of Hebrew rebels held out against the Romans before committing mass suicide rather than be taken captive. It was apparently not a huge story in Jewish history until Zionism began. You know, the whole reject namby-pamby girly religious stuff and kick ass. It's also a thing to do impromptu bar mitzvahs at the top of the fortress, which of course is inspiring. I'm an asshole. It was all I could do to avoid rolling my eyes as they trotted out Israeli Arabs, Druze, and Bedouins as model minorities to repeat the bullshit refrain that it was better to be a second-class citizen in Israel than in any other Arab country. To fermer my bouche and not be the one to tell all the other people on my trip having an inspiring experience that there was no Santa Claus, no Jewish Santa Claus. By the final night, though, even my own resolve began to erode. I was starting to realize the people in my group were actually super cool humans. And it's hard not to fall under the spell of Tel Aviv, with its gorgeous street art, sidewalk cafes, and hedonistic beaches. It's like an aesthetic mix of Bushwick and Santa Monica. The final night, I met my cousin Daniel, who immigrated to Israel from Cleveland several years ago and is just as frustrated with religious extremism taking over Israel as I was. I could live here, I thought, as we sat sipping artisanal lattes and engaged in a lively political discourse. And then the next morning, I ended up making lunch for Sheldon Adelson. Yeah, Newt Gingrich, Bibi Netanyahu, and Donald Trump supporting Sheldon Adelson. That Sheldon Adelson. He was in town to fundraise for Mitt Romney and decided to stop by our program where we were cooking lunch for soldiers on an army base. He's the single biggest donor to Birthright, and the thought that I was just accepting his racism money made me want to vomit into the goddamn mashed potatoes. I, the granddaughter of a man who was court-martialed in World War II for beating the shit out of a racist British officer, is now chiffonading parsley for the guy funding hate speech. After lunch, we were told he was going to address us. And to our program leader's credit, she came to us. She said, yes, he has super public political views, but he gives us a lot of money. Please don't make a scene. It was honest, if depressing. The aging casino magnate actually started with a touching account of his father never making it to the Holy Land, before inevitably telling us the Jews were in danger of annihilation by assimilation, and that it was our duty as advocates to Israel to oppose Muslim groups on campus. Never mind that we were in the 22 to 27 age group and our campus days were behind us. So I left the wagging fingers of Sheldon Adelson and returned to New York with a bit more cred. At least I could say I had been to Israel somewhat recently, but still lacking much context. At the next J Street conference, I was outside a session, chatting like the Anne of Green Gables wannabe that I am, dumping my feelings word vomit style to another woman in the hallway. And she started telling me about this fully funded program in Jerusalem that was about multi-narrative Israel education. Kesher Hadash program is called, which means new connection. That sounds nice. Fully funded? Really, is that a thing? She gave me her card, which I lost. A few months later, I found it while cleaning and emailed her. Yes, the program was really a thing. Did I want to come visit the Jewish Theological Seminary? I ended up visiting JTS's campus near Columbia right after Valentine's Day. Weirdly, there wasn't really talk about me applying. I'd have to fill out an application as a formality, but they seemed to want me. Really want me, which was amazing because I was in the process of a super ugly breakup. And as I was crying in the Columbia Barnes & Noble, reading my ex's vitriolic Facebook messages, the idea that someone who wasn't Sheldon Adelson would fully fund a trip for me to go to Israel was incredibly reassuring to my sense of being. But despite my warm reception at JTS, I still had a hard time believing it could be a thing. I was still in recovery from playwriting grad school and was used to expecting rejections from any big, shiny thing. There must be something wrong with these guys, I figured. What's that Groucho Marx phrase? I refuse to join any club that will accept me as a member. And then Israel invaded Gaza again. This was it. This was not going to work. This is why I wouldn't be able to go. This is what happens when I always suggest on Facebook I'm in a relationship. There were bombs, and there was going to be a security situation, and I would be stuck working at Trader Joe's and adjuncting forever. But then somehow it was still on. I booked a flight. Someone named Naama was visiting apartments for me. And then I was on a plane, calling Verizon to cancel my service. And when are you leaving the country? In about 10 minutes. And then it all began. I'd met a couple of my cohort at pre-orientation events. They all had these fancy Jewish resumes and much better Hebrew. The kind of experience I probably would have had if closed-minded idiots hadn't fucked me up and sent me screaming from institutional Judaism for 10 years. So I felt I had a lot to overcompensate for. The first 10-day stretch of our trip was like Bizarro World Birthright. We went to a lot of the same places, Independence Hall, the Western Wall, but instead of being asked to have some sort of come to Jewish Jesus moment where we'd all start crying, we were pushed to question our assumptions. We went to the African refugee neighborhood in South Tel Aviv and got a graffiti tour of the city. We visited the Roman-era ruins at Sipori and pored over the testimony of a Palestinian who had lived in the area when it was called Safaria. Get ugly. Go deep. Intellectually, I was like Meg Ryan in the diner, screaming, yes, yes, yes! Socially, on the other hand, things first got weird when one of the members of our group came up to me at our hotel in Tel Aviv and asked me if I was someone's wife. What? Apparently, because I was wearing mostly black and hid my messy hair under a hat, he and others operated under the assumption that I was a divorced Orthodox woman or something. I'm from New York. I explained, I do theater. I then started to lament my entire approach to packing for this trip. Oh my God, there were so many sluttier clothes I could have brought. Oh. And then we end up with an odd number of females in the group, and I'm left with a room to myself and break out crying in the hotel lobby out of fear of FOMO and social rejection. Then the 10-day program ends. We move into our apartments in Jerusalem. I don't have any friends here yet. And classes don't start for another 3 days. So everything's closed in Saturdays in Jerusalem. So I decided today would be as good a day as any to visit Jerusalem's Muslim quarter. The silence on the streets for Shabbat caught me off guard. No buses, no cars, like the Ray Bradbury story where a nuclear disaster wipes out all organic life on the planet, but the human-built mechanized structures still live on. It felt like all those Christmas Eves in Ohio when my dad and I would drive home from the movies and see the only store open was Walmart. Walking through the different neighborhoods of West Jerusalem, you get to see the history of the country. Quaint German cottages blocks away from more square, 30s-style apartment units and ornate Palestinian houses. Grand Ottoman palaces alongside contemporary metal playgrounds, where Tel Aviv is crowded, chaotic, disjointed. Jerusalem is airy, orderly. We can partially thank the British for that. During the Mandate period in the 20s, they decreed that all buildings would be built with beige Jerusalem stone. And when the British left, the Israeli government decided to keep it. So despite the mishmash of different architectural styles and eras, West Jerusalem has a kind of Pleasantville sense of unity. You also get a history course through the street signs in Hebrew, English, and Arabic, named after significant figures in Jewish and Western history, from King George to Zeev Jabotinsky to Abraham Lincoln. In the Old City, passing through Jaffa Gate for the first time without a tour party. It was still early enough in the day that services would still be going on, so the streets of the Jewish quarter are empty of the sight of Hasidic men in their long black coats. No throngs of smiling birthright groups in hoodies to make me feel bad about not feeling Jewish enough. Without a schedule, I'm free to wander as I choose. Occasionally a vendor would beckon me over to check out some of his tchotchkes, but smiled weakly and moved on. Since I'd be here for several months, I did not have to stuff souvenirs into my soul searching today. Signs indicated I was near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and I realized that in 3 times to the Old City over the last decade, I had never visited it. I'd never set foot in the Christian quarter at all. I mean, as far as most birthright groups are concerned, areas of Jerusalem outside of the Jewish quarter might as well not exist. In the Christian quarter, I saw Jerusalem as it probably looks to the rest of the world. Souvenir yarmulkes and mezuzahs are replaced with carved nativity scenes, crucifixes, and pictures of Jesus. Well, visitors of the Jewish quarter are a lot of white, college-aged Americans. Here I saw a greater cross-section of the world population. Middle-aged couples on tours from Middle America, groups from India, and whole families from Europe. Sort of like Times Square. It's kind of comforting. Weird. I envied these Gentile pilgrims. You know, for them, Jerusalem is just a place. I mean, a place with meaning, sure, but a place that placed no demands on them. Their Jerusalem didn't judge them for wearing the wrong kind of yarmulke or demand they advocate for it. Their Jerusalem would be there without them. Following the signs pointing to the Temple Mount, I saw the signs turn to Arabic and the tourists give way to women in hijabs. Corner was turned and I was in the Arab shuk, a living, breathing organism. The breadth of activity was people going out about their daily lives as opposed to soaking up the religious setting. Vendors selling meat, spices, electronics. I've been told I should feel nervous here as a Jewish woman. A cousin's wife said she didn't like Jerusalem because there are too many Arabs. But everyone seemed perfectly civil to me here, mostly focused on carrying out their own lives. Of course, I also looked more like an American tourist than a religious Jewish person. I approached the entrance to the Temple Mount, and an Israeli soldier stopped me. Only for Muslims. I shrugged and turned around. The rain starts to fall, and I thought of places to take shelter. I end up ordering a plate of hummus at a touristy cafe with a space heater owned by a Palestinian guy who did some graduate work at Rutgers, where I adjunct. Go Jersey. Classes start, and it's a relief. There's a bus that stops near my apartment, but I am a cheap bastard and decide to take the 40-minute walk from the German colony to Rehavia, where we take classes across the street from the Prime Minister's residence. Unlike the White House, the Prime Minister's residence in Israel isn't some huge, imposing palace. It's a square, mid-century modernist house next to a bunch of other square, blocky, modernist houses. That level of intimacy, seeming accessibility, no doubt adds to the sense that Israel is less a country than one big neighborhood. Feels less like Washington, D.C.'s National Mall than an LA suburb. Occasionally we're informed that the entrance to the street will be periodically closed due to security functions. And sometimes we see protesters pitching a tent outside the gates. In classes, affable British Israeli academics assign readings on the history of Zionism and the nitpicky disagreements from the beginning of the state. Like how the not Ashkenazi elite, white Jews of European descent, aka people who look like me, were super racist toward Middle Eastern Jewish immigrants in the 50s. And in the 70s, their kids formed an Israeli Black Panther movement. We read Israeli Knesset debates from 1950 over whether or not Israel should have a constitution. Oh, by the way, Israel doesn't actually have a constitution. And it's like the ultimate WWE smackdown of Israeli arguing. And it's amazing. And for the first time, politically at least, I am in the majority of a Jewish group as a leftist. Except I still don't really have friends. I mean, that's not entirely true. It happens to be my luck that the people I emotionally connect with are the people who politically are completely different sides of the spectrum. Now suddenly, I'm feeling like a jerk for steamrolling my conservative friends' beliefs the way people on March of the Living and Birthright steamrolled mine. Like when we go to an art gallery and hear from an Israeli painter whose parents were Holocaust survivors. She makes these paintings about surveillance culture and drew parallels between Israel's military behavior toward the Palestinians and the Nazi regime. This should totally be in my wheelhouse. I mean, a coming full circle of my Holocaust Israel angst. But it really bothered one of my friends. Someone else started pushing up against the artist forcefully, and the whole thing became this big shouting match in the middle of the art gallery. And my friend was in tears. And I wished I didn't give a shit. For my program, we were assigned mentors. They called them tutors to help with our projects. I was assigned this Israeli woman named Daphna, who had a theater company. It turned out I had seen some of her husband's poetry work at the 14th Street Y a few years ago, and it was amazing. She asked me to send her some of my stuff. Sheepishly, I sent her my story or piece or whatever about being obsessed with Nazis as a kid. Terrified of what this awesome, smart, badass Israeli woman would think. But she liked it. She really liked it. Okay, so I wasn't the worst person in the world. She suggested I dig deeper, read Israeli Arab writers. And the day after the shitty Israeli election, in which Netanyahu and the right wing had a huge shitty victory, she met me in Tel Aviv and took me to Rabin Square for the first time, where 20 years earlier, the prime minister had been shot, and my whole Israel angst had begun. And it was so freeing. It was an opening to feel like internally I could push up against the political nihilism of not just Americans, Jews, but also my Israeli family members. I might not have the cred to debate, hold on, but I was meeting people who could. That maybe the whole 10 Jews, 12 opinions thing was just as true for Israelis as I knew it to be true for Americans. And that maybe this place wasn't so alien after all, that this was a conversation I was allowed to be a part of. Fuck birthright. Halfway through our trip, we finally got to meet some Palestinians. That's not entirely true. We had lectures with Palestinian speakers. We took a tour of the Celebration Barrier in Bethlehem, covered in protest graffiti. And I had taken to hanging out in East Jerusalem on Saturdays to get away from the zombie apocalypse that was Jewish Jerusalem. But this was going to be different. This time we were going to be in the same class with them, not just talking about Palestinians or having Palestinians talk at us, but talking with them. The initial class was kind of awkward. I think I was a bit much. Real-life Palestinians! I had never actually spoken to a woman in a hijab before. There were 4 in this class that included our American group and a handful of Jewish Israelis. All the Muslim women were sweet, pleasant, if almost universally silent. I like your hijab, I told one woman next to me. She said thank you, and we talked awkwardly. Did they all feel repressed? Was it true what they said about repressed Muslim women in hijabs? Or was it maybe they felt like they couldn't really talk because Israelis were there? This wasn't their turf, after all. And this class was also just a gen ed for them. Everyone at this college was required to take a diversity in Israel class for their education degree. This happened to be a special section of it. Most of them probably didn't give a fuck about having a meaningful experience. A meaningful experience that will have literally no bearing on their lives. The lives that are about getting a degree, supporting their kids, actual stuff. I mean, probably on a subconscious level, they wouldn't want to be any part of some sort of normalization, props for the Israelis to use as propaganda. The class also wasn't really that organized, so in one activity they asked us to get in groups and solve the problem of borders in Jerusalem. Thank God for Rania. She was one of the only people in the group, not just Muslim women, who didn't seem supremely uncomfortable with everything that was happening. You know, when you just fall in love with another woman, not so much like that you want to like have sex with them, but like absorb their energy and their awesomeness, or lay prostrate at their feet and offer them sacrifices. Rania was older than most of us. She had kids in college. She lived in North Carolina. She had lived in Dubai, or was it Saudi Arabia? I mean, she was probably more cultured and cosmopolitan than most of us. And the fact that she did speak the sort of language of, I don't know, whiteness or globalization, I could be like, see, Palestinians can be smart and open-minded and have a sense of humor. And she soon became like all of our moms in the class. She helped the other Muslim girls speak out and helped some of the American Jews relax a bit more. The Israelis sort of kept to themselves, or rather, they kept to the Americans. You got the sense that there was a whole conversation happening internally inside people's heads that never really came to the surface. After the class was over, Rania invited me and some of the other American women over to her house for dinner with her family. As we drove through the section of East Jerusalem where she lived, Rania pointed out where certain Jews had started a settlement right in the middle of her town. At her house, there was that magical moment when she took off her hijab. Maybe it's the Orientalist in me coming out to be so fascinated by this, but I felt like I was being let into some sort of secret. Later, her husband and kids came home. It's always jarring to have friends whose kids it would not be illegal for you to date. The oldest was trying to start an indie rock band. Another was starting at Hebrew U. The 16-year-old proudly showed off her collection of John Green novels and told me to read Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. One of the girls wore a hijab in public. The others didn't. Her husband pulled out his computer and showed us a collection of old photos from the last 100 years in Jerusalem. And afterward, we watched the American zombie romance film Warm Bodies. And she and her family were who I wanted to point to when an Israeli family member was trying to tell me that if you talk to the average Palestinian, they'll tell you that they want to send us all into the sea. And I'm like, bitch, please, how many average Palestinians do you speak to? If I had some sort of magic, something, I would find a way to screenshot or capture or transport the scene of Rania and her beautiful Muslim Palestinian Brady Bunch family to my Israeli relatives to show we aren't that different or some shit. When it came time to choose groups for projects, I wanted to work with Rania, but I thought that might look a little desperate, too needy. So I focused on Lubna, one of the more withdrawn Muslim women in our group. One of the tasks we had was to choose a place in Jerusalem that is meaningful to take all of us. The idea was that everyone would see the city through the eyes of one of the different cultural groups. The American Jewish guy in our group declared he wanted to go to the Kotel, the Western Wall. And Lubna immediately said, I can't go there. I know you're wrong, he insisted, and attempted to explain how there was no restriction on barring Muslims from entering the Kotel Plaza. But he agreed maybe the Jewish quarter in general would be fine. So on the day of, he and I met Lubna and her husband outside of Jaffa Gate. They were a bit late, probably because they had to make sure their kids had someone to stay with. I was admittedly flabbergasted by meeting Lubna's husband because he was fucking gorgeous. Not that Lubna was unattractive, but it took me off guard. Where Lubna was withdrawn, her husband was open and talkative, chatting away with my classmate in perfect Hebrew. And I had to be in a situation where I was the one person in a group of, they include 2 Palestinians who couldn't understand the Hebrew